all one can ever do through lifestyle choices is affect the odds that something happens to you, right? But, being vegan isn't going to protect you in a accident with a bus, right? And it reduces your odds that you'll get a deadly cancer. It doesn't reduce them to zero.
As a vegan, do you ever feel like you're living in a parallel universe, aware of things that many others don't even seem to notice, let alone acknowledge? I'm Chrissy Benson, host of the Vegan Posse podcast. We talk with vegans from around the globe who, like you, are living lives of integrity and compassion with an eye toward justice. Through their personal stories, you'll come to see that you're not an outlier. In fact, you're part of an entire posse of individuals who aren't just keeping the peace, they're creating it through their food choices and beyond. You won't be saddling up, but you're in for the ride of your life. Welcome to the Vegan Posse. Hey Posse, I'm Chrissy Benson, host of the Vegan Posse podcast. As always, there's lots happening here in Music City, and sometimes very different worlds intersect, as happened this past weekend when I went to the Worldwide Bitcoin Conference, which was being held in Nashville. Now, there's a little more to this story, but while I was there, I wound up being interviewed by a journalist from Wired magazine in a story about Bitcoin and Trump, of all things. But they mentioned Vegan Posse, and I consider that a huge win for animals. Wired has something like 30 million online readers, and I love that they're going to see the word vegan in such a completely unexpected place. The full story link is in the show notes below if you'd like to check it out. And while you're at it, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the Vegan Posse on Spotify and YouTube to let vegans who care know that they're not alone. And now for today's episode. I don't generally opt to hang out with other lawyers when I can help it, but I make an exception when I'm at Vegan Summerfest. Michael Dorf is the Robert S. Stevens Professor of Law at Cornell University, where he teaches and writes about constitutional law and related subjects, including justice movements. He's authored over 100 scholarly articles and essays for law journals and peer-reviewed science and social science journals, as well as thousands of essays for blogs and other forums. Mike is also the author or co-author of 6 books, including Beating Hearts, Abortion and Animal Rights, which he co-authored with his late wife, fellow vegan law professor Sherry Colb. Mike and Sherry raised 2 vegan daughters, and among his many accomplishments, he was the undefeated pie-eating champion at Cornell. So in this discussion, Mike and I do talk about the law, but we also talk about a lot more interesting and some deeply personal things. So enjoy this conversation with Mike Dorf. Mike, welcome to the Vegan Posse. Are you ready for the ride of your life?
I suppose I am.
So I met you just recently at Vegan Summerfest in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. But since then, I've learned that we've overlapped a great deal, geographically and professionally, as well as ideologically. So for one, you went to Harvard for undergrad and law school, and I lived in Boston from 2001 to 2010. And as you know, Boston is where my novel Marrying Myself is set. And I also learned that you taught at Rutgers University, which is where both my parents went to college. So even though it took until last week for our paths to cross, I think they were destined to at some point.
Small world.
Yes. But I like to start back at the beginning. So why don't you talk a little about where you grew up? And as a kid, did you ever think about the animals in our food system?
So I can start with the second question first, and the answer is, I'm ashamed to say, not really. I grew up, so I was born in Brooklyn, New York. My family moved out to the suburbs of Long Island when I was a little kid, so 3.5. It was a kind of traditional mid 60s, early 70s childhood. So I'm 60 now. So that, I was born in 1964. The both my parents worked, although my mom, who was a school teacher, took a few years off when my sister and I were little. I have a sister who's 3 years older than I am, but they cooked us pretty traditional, American food. I was an extremely chubby child, and I have the photographic evidence to prove that. I was aware of vegetarians as a kid. I have a cousin who was a vegetarian, a sort of distant cousin. I now have another cousin who's a vegan activist, but he was raised the same way I was. But this other cousin was vegetarian. I remember her being teased a little bit at family gatherings, and I thought of myself as someone who loved animals. We didn't have a dog or a cat when I was a kid. And parents convinced me I was allergic to cats. I am a little bit, but either I outgrew it or I never really was that strong. So if I go to a house of someone who has a cat, I'm fine. I had guinea pigs as a kid. I loved my guinea pigs. They were, cute and cuddly. And somehow I didn't connect any of that to what I was eating.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's true of a lot of us, even most of us. So that makes total sense. So, speaking of Vegan Summerfest, when I attended in the past, one of my favorite speakers there was a law professor named Sherry Colb, who wrote a book called Mind If I Order the Cheeseburger. And I was very sad when I heard the announcement in 2022 that she had died of cancer. So when I met you last week at Summerfest, I did not at first realize that she was your wife of over 30 years. So first of all, my sincere condolences.
Thank you.
How did you and Sherry first meet?
So we met in law school. I'm 2 years older than Sherry was, but I was 1 year ahead of her in law school because I did something in between college and law school, and she went straight through. We were both taking a winter term course, which is something they did at the time at Harvard Law School. I think they still do that, which means a sort of condensed 3-week class in which you do a semester's worth of work for one class in the course of 3 weeks. And it was a class in trial advocacy. So kind of think of it as like mock trial. The culmination of the class is a little mock trial, and she and I were paired against one another. And she had a partner. Actually, her partner is now someone who's relatively well known, Norman Eisen, President Obama's ambassador to the Czech Republic. He's now co-chair of an organization called Citizens for Responsible Ethics in Washington, which brought a lot of lawsuits against the Trump administration, and is generally a sort of ethical watchdog. But anyway, Norm and Sherry were partners, and my partner Elliot and I were paired against them, and we got to know each other through this. The way we used to tell the story was the made up facts involved a murder, and I was the prosecuting side, and Sherry's side was defending the. No, I think it was the other way around. Yeah, it was the other way around. She was the prosecutor. I was the defense attorney, and he was charged with murder. The jury, which consisted of middle school girls, convicted my client of manslaughter, which we regarded as a kind of compromise and a good way to get started. And so we started dating. I think shortly after the trial. It would have been unethical to date while we were on opposing sides of this fake trial, and then we were married. I guess. Was a little over a year later. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Pretty fast.
Right.
So you both went vegan in 2006, or pretty early in your marriage. What led you to that decision, and was it mutual?
Yeah. So I mean, that's not that early. So we were married in 1991. So we were married for. So we had gone by stages earlier. So you mentioned earlier that I taught at Rutgers. So I taught at Rutgers Camden for the first 3 years of my academic career. Now Rutgers is one law school with two campuses. In those days, it was two separate law schools, one in Camden and one in Newark. And so we lived in South Jersey for a few years and then moved to the New York City area when I moved from Rutgers Camden to Columbia, and Sherry moved from Rutgers Camden to Rutgers Newark. One of Sherry's colleagues at Rutgers Newark, who's still there, is Gary Francione, who listeners will know as a vegan activist. And, Sherry, and through her eye, so together, I think we were listening to Gary for a long time before we sort of made changes. And then we started to do it gradually in a way that I think a lot of people do that. I don't actually recommend. That is my recommendation to people going vegan is to just, do it sort of a meal at a time. But we did it sort of an animal or a class of animals at a time. So first we stopped eating mammals, then we stopped eating birds, then we stopped eating fish, and eventually we cut out dairy. So progress, I think, took place over the course of about 3 years or so. So even though we went vegan in 2006, I think the journey started in 2003 with changes, and probably earlier than that with changes in our way of thinking.
And were you talking to Gary Francione about this journey of yours?
So not really. I mean, Gary, so Sherry would, one of the things she used to do for her colleagues at Rutgers was she would bake for faculty meetings just for fun. And I think at some point she started baking vegan cookies and things just because she wanted Gary to be able to enjoy them. So he really appreciated that. And, Gary he's very outspoken on social media and his writing. At Rutgers, at the time, he and his partner Anna ran an animal rights clinic. They since backed off of that because of various obstacles from the state government. But he's less vocal about his veganism on the faculty, or at least he was when I was closely associated there. But yes, we talked to him, we read stuff, and so it's I persuaded that veganism was right for us before we actually did it. And as to the question of like, did we do this simultaneously? We sort of leapfrogged each other. So I think Sherry cut out birds before I did. I remember at a point at which we were still eating birds, Sherry brought home a picture of a turkey that she had paid to support at a farm sanctuary. We're still living in New York City. And I looked at it and I said, what's that? And she explained. I said, well, I'm still eating birds. And she said, I know. And then I cut them out a week later because I couldn't put the picture of the turkey right there. And then I used to tell people that I went vegan before Sherry did because on the day that we went vegan, I didn't eat breakfast and she did. And so that was the difference.
So you edged her out. I see.
Yes.
A cutthroat vegan competition.
And when we finally did that, our kids were 4 and 2 at the time. So the 2-year-old, who's now 20, has really no recollection of not being vegan. Our older daughter sort of remembers, and there was a brief period when she was sort of cheating, and then that faded.
So did you talk to your daughters about this transition?
A little bit. I mean, I don't, it's hard to explain all that much to a 2-year-old, but certainly Mina, who was 4 and a half at the time, yeah, we talked to her and she understood it. I mean, kids, I think, we've all had this experience, right? Kids are naturally appalled at the idea of eating animals, right? It's only they find out, they're like, oh, I don't want to do that. It seems sort of logical to them. The harder part was that we had nanny for them for a few days a week, and she wanted to cooperate, but we were all sort of figuring it out together at the time.
Did you wrestle with the choice of whether to raise your daughters vegan, or was it just clear to you that once you'd made this change, it was going to translate to your daughters as well?
Yeah, so no, it was easy. I think partly because they were so young, right? And occasionally when they were little, people would say, are you raising your kids to be vegan? And we would say things like, well, yeah, of course. I mean, because for us, it's an ethical matter. And in the same way that we wouldn't raise our kids to be racist or sexist or homophobic, well, we're not going to raise them to be speciesist. And, we had done enough reading to know that this was undoubtedly healthy for them. So, yeah, it wasn't much of an issue. I know that people who go vegan when they have kids who are sort of teenagers, that's a more complicated story.
Right, right. And for you, how did the law and, this new arrival into the animal rights realm, how did those two areas intersect for you?
Yeah, so at first they didn't really, except to the extent that, when I announced to my colleagues at the time at Columbia that I was vegan, it was just like, so can you get me something to eat if there's sometimes there'd be events, right? And so I didn't want to have to eat just the salad, so and they were very accommodating. So that was easy. I didn't really connect my sort of professional life to these issues for some period of time. I'm sure if I went back, so I have a blog, Dorf on Law, which I coincidentally, I've been publishing since 2006. So I started it almost exactly when I went vegan, although
Hmm.
that's just kind of a coincidence. And I'd been writing popular columns since 2000 for originally a site called Find Law, then something called Verdict, which I'm still doing. And, I would say about 5% of the things I write, maybe somewhat lower, have some kind of vegan or animal rights theme. Uh, I don't know when I first started doing that. I'd have to go back and look, but it wasn't a big part of my scholarly or professional life for a while. And really, what changed things was Summerfest. So we moved to Ithaca in 2008 and found the Ithaca vegan community. And one of the people who's in the local community is Amy Hamlin. I don't know if you've had her on your show, but so Amy is a vegan activist. She's the founder and director of an organization called the Coalition for Healthy School Foods, which works to bring vegan meals into public schools. They've been very successful. She's worked with Eric Adams in New York City, and they're expanding to lots of other places. But Amy was part of the local community, and she told us about Summerfest. And so I think it was either 2009 or possibly 2010, but probably 2009. We just started going. And when we first went, uh, it was as, participants to go to the panels, to meet people. Kids were little. They had the so-called children's center where they could play. Um, but you learn a lot of things. And Sherry incorporated that stuff into her own work before I did. So she decided she wanted to teach a class in animal rights, which is highly unusual in law schools. A lot of law schools have a class in animal law. Cornell now does, which is taught by Marianne Sullivan, who's another vegan podcaster and activist. But there weren't really many animal rights classes. You'd find them in philosophy departments, but not really in a law school. And so that came out of experiences at Summerfest. And then once she started teaching that, she started writing about it. And then I would occasionally as well. So she taught this class in animal rights for years. She'd teach it, most years. And it was taught in a law school, and there were legal materials, right? So they would read the Israeli Supreme Court's foie gras decision. They'd read some of the cases coming out of the Non-Human Rights Project litigation on behalf of captive chimpanzees and later elephant. But the sort of takeaway from the class was that legal changes are not very effective at creating social change until there's a kind of critical mass of public opinion, so that things like Animal Welfare Act or the Humane Slaughter Act, right, are riddled with exceptions. They're barely enforced, they're extremely meager, and that's by design, because they're not the product of animal rights activists getting what they want. They're what industry is willing to tolerate and what the public is willing is want, which is very, very minimal. So the sort of theory of the role of the law that Sherry developed, and this is borrowed from literature in other areas as well, is that the main job of the lawyer for a kind of still small social justice movement is to protect the activists. So, you want to attack things like ag-gag laws. You want to make it possible entrepreneurs who want to create plant-based milks to label it as plant-based milk rather than, what the industry wants you to call it, which is, fluid from nuts or something. And so that was the way in which the law entered into it, mostly for Sherry. And I think I was very much influenced by that. I'm a little bit, I think, more agnostic than she was. I think her view was generally that the legal measures, the campaigns for larger cages, whatever, that those were almost a waste of time. My view is that they might make marginal improvements, but they also could have some impact in terms of moving the dial or sort of opening the Overton window or something like that.
Right. Yeah. I've wrestled with those questions myself as well, because as a lawyer by training, I never felt intuitively that the law was the path to animal liberation, even though I'm happy to support efforts in that direction. But what you say about protecting the activists, that makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, regarding those other sort of welfare measures. I know Gary Francione speaks very vehemently that they are a waste of time. I'm not convinced that they're a total waste of time, but at the same time, they're also not where I choose to focus my activist
Yeah,
energy.
that's where I think both Sherry and I ended up. We have a chapter in our book, Beating Hearts, Abortion and Animal Rights, on activism, and what we say is that it's ultimately an empirical question whether the path to abolition runs through welfare reform or whether welfare reform is a kind of off-ramp. And our ultimate conclusion is that, you can't control the movement anyway. It's animal rights, animal welfare movement is like diverse. People have different approaches, and so you just hope that some of it works.
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, I was at the animal rights conference years ago when Gary Francione debated somebody on that very question. And it was an interesting discussion, interesting debate. And like you said, it is an empirical question. I just don't feel that anybody necessarily has the definitive answer. Do welfare reforms and activism in that direction, do they help the cause or hurt the cause, and what's the most effective way? Is it pure abolitionism or is it welfare? Like who knows? I don't
Yeah,
know that
and,
anyone
and
has the answer.
the you can point to historical precedents in either direction, right? So, and we do this in the book. So, think of the sort of classic example of meliorist measures being an off-ramp is social welfare programs in Bismarck's Germany and then under FDR in the United States, right? If you ask, well, why wasn't there a communist revolution in Germany, which is where Karl Marx thought it would be? Why wasn't there a more active, socialist movement in the United States? One conventional answer is because the mainstream politicians co-opted enough of the program to reform capitalism to make it tolerable. And that meant that it sapped the energy from the working class revolution, right? This is the Trotskyite view, right? The worse, the better. I'm not sure that's exactly accurate with respect to the history there, but that's a sort of one kind of paradigm. But then there are all sorts of other things places we can point to where sort of halfway measures did pave the way. So I think about the movement for marriage equality, and there was a lot of debate in the 90s and the first few years of the 2000s about whether civil unions, domestic partnerships were a kind of off ramp or a gateway. And they turned out, I think, pretty clearly to be a gateway to marriage equality. And you can have other examples. So it's not just an empirical question. It's an empirical question that is very, very complex and hard to answer, and is going to be, influenced by all sorts of things that are very hard to predict.
Right, right. And there's no truly comparable social justice movement. I read a really interesting book, maybe you're familiar with it, called Changing the Game by Norm Phelps.
Uh huh.
If you've read
I
that
know.
one.
I know Norm Phelps's work. Yeah, but
Okay, yeah, because one of the other social justice movements that I've long been, a student of and rather obsessed with is the movement to end human slavery, the abolitionist movement. And in Changing the Game, he talks about how even the abolitionist movement was different because the way that ultimately succeeded was they managed to change the minds and hearts of Northerners who did
mm-hmm.
not own human slaves and therefore did not have skin in the game. They could,
Right.
they were freer to shift their philosophical view of that question. Whereas when it comes to animals in our food system, almost everybody's eating them. So there's
Right. Yeah.
nobody who doesn't have a
Yeah.
personal stake.
Yeah, I mean, there are other differences as well, right? Of course, which is in most social justice movements, the people who are complaining, right? And here,
Right, right. And
right,
ultimately take over the movement
right,
or,
right,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Interesting stuff. Um, so how has animal rights, increasingly filtered or into or become part of your professional work, or has it?
Yeah, so it has. I mean, my day job is as a constitutional lawyer, but because I have a blog and I write a column, I have to produce a lot of material. So I write something for popular consumption roughly 3 times each week, and that's in addition to my teaching and my sort of more conventional legal scholarship. And from time to time, that means writing something about veganism or animal rights. On the biggest piece was, of course, this book that Sherry and I wrote together that on abortion and animal rights. And that was something we'd been thinking about for years. We taught a seminar together once. This was different from her animal rights class on human rights and animal rights. And we actually had a kind of plan for a book, a couple of different books. First, we were going to write a piece, one that was going to compare and contrast and develop analogies between the death penalty and animal slaughter. And we actually wrote up a proposal. It was accepted. And then we decided we wanted to broaden that because we concluded that we wanted to talk more broadly about parallels between various forms of movements. And that's where this idea for the seminar of human rights and animal rights grew out of. We wrote a bunch of bits and pieces, and then Sherry got sick. And so the last piece we co-authored prior to her death, which was the basis for one of the presentations I gave at Summerfest, was originally supposed to be a chapter in that book on human rights and animal rights, and that's got the title "If We Didn't Eat Them, They Wouldn't Exist," right? And then has a subtitle that most people don't understand. So that's it's definitely part of my scholarship, and I also write about it, as I say, for my blog. So I had a piece a few weeks ago about Joey Chestnut, was this hot dog eating champion who was kicked out of the Coney Island contest
Yeah,
because
I heard about that.
yeah, because he had a deal to endorse Impossible hot dogs. And he's not a vegan, he's not a vegan activist, but I was interested more in the reaction to all of that. So I would say that most of my writing about veganism and animal rights is more public facing, with the exception of that pretty technical philosophical article. It's more on my blog, in my columns, but I'm not against including it in some of my scholarship. So I do a lot of different kinds of work. One of my lines of work was in collaboration with a colleague of mine in the government department named Sidney Tarrow, who is a very influential scholar in social movements, and so he I've written a bit drawing on the work I've done with him about the things like ag and how litigation can win by losing. So that he was very influential for me there. So my as listeners might know, the Non-Human Rights Project has never won a case. Right? They've had some interim victories and they've gotten some powerful dissents, but they've lost all of their cases. Nonetheless, my work with Sid Tarrow has persuaded me that litigation has been successful in another sense, which is by raising consciousness. And so that's a big theme. A lot of the social movement literature about impact litigation is that the impact is not simply that a court orders a defendant to do this, that, or the other thing, but that the case itself brings attention to an issue. And then even if it doesn't succeed in the court, it can succeed in the legislature. There can be a referendum. There can be social change, et cetera.
Right. And as a lawyer, do you ever envision the status of animals, non-human animals under the law changing, for animals to become, to go from being considered property to persons under the law?
I mean, I certainly hope so. To me, that's at the point at which that happens, we will have succeeded. So this is another place I can talk about animal rights. I wrote a paper, this is almost 24, 25 years ago now, for the California Law Review, it was called The Paths to Legal Change. And it was a response to a lecture that had been given by Kathleen Sullivan, who at the time was the dean of Stanford Law School, in which she articulated a view about legal change and social change. And I wasn't really rebutting it so much as sort of using it as a launching point. And I talked about how the laws that protect people against various forms of discrimination only exist after there has been substantial success of the movements to end those forms of discrimination, right? So you're not going to get, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which forbids, race and sex discrimination in various dimensions, right, in the middle of the 19th century, because people are all invested in it. And so, and one of the examples I gave was the animal rights movement. I reject the kind of radical hypothesis that you only get legal change at the point at which you don't need it anymore, because there's mopping up to do. Often you can move people, right? So, if 60% of the population believe that animals are persons, we shouldn't eat them or exploit them, that's enough to get legislation, and then you can bring along the remaining 40%. There are, of course, some countries that have elaborate recognition of the rights of non-human animals, of the environment, but I think that in practice that doesn't mean very much because those are statements adopted by people who are invested in eating and otherwise using animals. So so they sound very nice, but it's a little bit like, Thomas Jefferson, who's enslaving people at Monticello, writing that, all men are created equal. Well, he must mean something different by that from what that sounds like to the modern ear.
Right. And I went to UVA undergrad, so well aware of Mr. Jefferson. That's how he's referred to
Hmm.
at UVA, Mr. Jefferson. Yes. His spoken ideals and his living living practices
Yeah.
differed a little bit, as they do for all of us, to be fair. Just get shifting gears a little bit. You and Sherry went vegan, quite some time ago, and shifted your way of eating. Did that did that kind of add to any sense of betrayal or just anger, circumstances at fate, whatever term you want to use, when Sherry got sick?
Um, I mean, a little bit, the right. So, if you've heard Michael Greger interviewed about his various books, right, he's careful to say that the title of the first one in this series is How Not to Die. It's not How to Not Die, right? And think that rationally always understood that all one can ever do through lifestyle choices is affect the odds that something happens to you, right? But, being vegan isn't going to protect you in a accident with a bus, right? And it reduces your odds that you'll get a deadly cancer. It doesn't reduce them to zero. So, Sherry was of course unhappy that she had and then died of cancer, but I don't recall her ever saying, that this is so unfair. And of course, whether something is unfair really depends on your baseline, right? Of course, it's unfair that anybody, you know, gets that, does that, right? There are people who are living lives of poverty and desperation throughout the world. There are billions and billions of sentient animals treated terribly. And so she was subject to depression in her life, but that seemed like an inherited condition. And she was not actually depressed about her illness. And she actually had come out of what had been the previous period of depression before she got sick, and it didn't make her depressed after that. I mean, she she didn't like the side effects of all the medications she was taking at the end, um, but there was not from her a sense of at least that I got that me. I think I might have been a bit reacted that way a bit more myself. So there's always that potential gap between your cognitive sense of your circumstances and your emotional one. But at least as far as I can tell, and I knew Sherry better than anybody, she was not resentful of the fact that she, as a vegan, was getting this, whereas, people who were a lifestyle that meant that their odds were greater were not.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really fascinating because I can't imagine in her shoes not having an additional resentment about that.
Yeah. I
So,
mean, I think the only resentment she had about the diet was that I would try to be like a bit controlling. So, once she had it, I was like, well, you should really have more broccoli sprouts and the mushrooms and not eat the dough. And she was like, back off.
and what about from other people? Did you get, maybe uncomfortable questions from other people? Like, how did this happen?
Not really. I mean, I think, there that we've been vegan long enough and, it's kind of an aggressive question to ask somebody, like, because it's almost blaming them for getting
Exactly.
cancer,
Yeah.
right? And so, I will say that one thing that it for to Sherry was to make her much more sensitive about the health messaging of the movement.
Mm,
So she continued to teach and believe that, a veganism, especially whole food veganism, which didn't she sometimes practiced, but not, near the last few years, that was, a healthy way to live. She did come to feel very strongly negative towards messaging that, seem to be to blame people for their illnesses, right? So there's somebody whom both Sherry and I really, really respect. She respected, and I still have great respect for it. And I think is a wonderful person. I won't name him. In one of his talks, he used to routinely, he was giving like, uh, various answers to typical questions. So he said, well, people ask like, where do you get your protein? And I say, where do you get your chemotherapy? And so Sherry thought about that like after she was, undergoing chemotherapy and thought like, well, that really is not you know, that's not going to win any converts.
right.
And it's just going to, you're trying to shame people for the, for the bad fate that befell them, even if, yeah, something they did was a contributing factor. I mean, part of it, I think, is a defense mechanism, right? So whenever you learn that somebody is diagnosed with lung cancer, I think it's very, very natural to ask yourself or somebody, well, were they a smoker? And that doesn't necessarily mean you're blaming them for getting lung cancer. I think what's going on there is you're saying, well, if they were, then because I'm not a smoker, well, I'm okay. Even though, non-smokers get lung cancer, there's radon exposure, there are all sorts of other environmental factors that can contribute to it. So I understand that it's sometimes coming from this sort of need to reassure oneself that this misfortune that befell somebody else won't befall you as well, but it can come across as a kind of victim blaming.
Yes, yes. And I think you're totally on target with kind of the thought process behind that. We want to think, well, I'm doing this differently. So therefore, fingers crossed, hopefully,
Yeah,
you
and there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with doing
sure.
the things that are going to, improve. They will mean that you live a healthier life while you're alive, and
Yeah.
that they, increase the odds that you will have a longer, healthier life. Right? Those are good things that people, sensibly ought to do. It's just in promoting that, you need to be careful not to give this other kind of blaming message.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's a very, very fine line and sometimes not so fine a line. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I can tell a
very
story.
interesting.
So many years ago, this was, I think, right around the time I had just gone vegan. I was teaching a seminar. I don't remember what the seminar was in right now, but for it must have had a pretty broad topic because of what the paper I'm about to describe was about. So I had a student who wrote a paper about the what he called the public health downside of the fat acceptance movement, in which he said that, of course, people should be happy with themselves, but insofar as overweight and obesity contribute to health risks, then you want to be careful about messaging that leads people not to make lifestyle changes that could benefit their health. And he did it sensitively. There was, I think, a piece of it where, it was hard to read it as anything other than, well, we should be careful about reducing this stigma because the stigma is motivating. And that seemed to me to be problematic. I think he got a good grade because he did it well, but I didn't end up agreeing with the paper.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a legal colleague at one point who was from Ghana, and she was carrying a great deal of excess weight. And she said that part of what caused her to continue being overweight was that in Ghana, she was revered and, and validated for being larger and being
Yeah, I mean, for most
grossly
of, right.
proportioned. And she
Yeah.
even said, I wish it hurt my self-esteem more to be fat, she
Mm.
said, because maybe then I'd be more motivated, but I feel pretty good,
Yeah, I
maybe.
mean, for most of human history, people have struggled to get enough calories, and so excess weight was a sign of prosperity, etc.
Yeah, yeah. Again, another fine line, a very interesting social dynamic, because it's, of course, like you said, we want people to love themselves and accept themselves and not live in shame and self-blame. And at the same time, nobody should settle for less than they really want when it comes to their health,
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's interesting. But one thing I love about veganism is that everyone can start doing it right now. We don't have to wait for the courts or the government or even corporations to do anything. We can all start eating vegan right this very moment and decline to participate in the animal-based food system. So, that said, how helpful do you think the law is, or will be, or should be, in terms of animal advocacy?
Yeah, so again, I think that the First Amendment is very helpful. There's a nice set of articles by Justin Marceau, who's um, he's an animal rights activist, but also a clinical law professor at the University of Denver, along with a colleague of his, Alan Chen, who's not an animal rights activist at all, but is interested in the First Amendment, about developing the theoretical framework for challenges to ag-gag laws. So can I assume that listeners know what ag-gag laws are? Okay,
Yeah.
so ag-gag laws are, at this point, state laws in the sort of big agricultural states that essentially make it criminal to go on to the property of, and they define it in various ways, but you can think of it as a sort of farm or a slaughterhouse, for the purpose of recording what's going on there. It's a kind of sort of souped up criminal trespass law, but focus on animal agriculture. And the premise of it, which I think is undoubtedly false, is that what animal activists are doing when they go onto these places is either some kind of sabotage or terrorism, which is virtually never the case. At most, they're sort of rescuing a downed animal that was going to be killed anyway, or that they are spreading false impressions or what have you. What's actually motivating the laws is that the lobbyists for animal agriculture have persuaded the legislature that it would be useful to have these laws so people don't know what's actually going on in the horrible conditions which these animals are raised and killed. And the courts have struck down some of these laws, mostly, though, on a ground that I think is not likely to be all that helpful going forward, which is that. So now I need to teach listeners a little bit about First Amendment law. The First Amendment says Congress should make no law respecting blah, blah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, abridging the freedom of speech. So no law doesn't literally mean no law, but in general, censorship is defined as laws that target speech. And the worst kind of laws targeting speech are those that target particular messages. So the court, in striking down one of these laws, said, well, we know that you're targeting the message of animal rights activists. That's not permissible. You can speak out against them, you can have other things, but you can't target them. That's what's sometimes called content discrimination. So that's how it was struck down. Now, it hasn't happened yet, but if I were, if I were held hostage and made to be a lawyer for the animal agriculture industry, I would go back to those state legislatures and say, okay, pass just a much broader criminal trespass law that makes it a crime to go on some business without permission of the owners or using false pretenses, regardless of your purpose. Then it won't be a law that singles out speech at all, much less speech based on its content. So Justin and Alan have developed this argument, and I think it's pretty persuasive, that even that kind of a law, as applied to people who are investigative journalists, should be deemed a violation of the First Amendment, because the First Amendment is not only about disseminating information, it's also about finding out information. That's the sort of heart of journalism. If you think about, classic undercover journalism, like, Upton Sinclair writing The Jungle, right? That's what he's doing. So I think, that's a great development. I would love to see, in the event that animal agriculture lawyers are listening to this podcast and they take my idea and run with it, which you shouldn't do because that, would be, I hope they're not listening. Right. But in the event that that happens, and I'm not really too worried that they'll get the idea from me because it's kind of an obvious next step. But in the event that that happens, I would hope that this argument is available against it. So that's I think one way in which the law can be very helpful to the animal rights movement. Another way, which I mentioned earlier, is in protecting entrepreneurs. So I don't know if you've had Tammy Bryant on your show ever. So Tammy is a vegan and a law professor at UCLA. And for a while, she was very interested in challenging laws that made it difficult to start vegan businesses. So some of this is at the national level, right? That the USDA defines milk as a secretion from the lacteal secretion of a mammal, even though, of course, in common parlance, we have things, expressions like, the milk of human kindness. But the result is that this hasn't gone that far yet, but you could have a national ban on labeling various vegan products as alternatives to the animal-based products that they're designed to replace, and that makes them seem less palatable. So challenges to that are available. Sherry wrote an article along those lines. So another example is some friends of mine who live in California wanted to make some vegan goods and then sell them, but under California law, they couldn't do it in their kitchen because they had pets, and you can't have that in a kitchen that's producing food for sale. The way my friend put it sardonically was, it's okay to have animals in your kitchen so long as they're dead, right? So if the animal is the food, then that's fine. But if the animal if it happens to be a cat who's walking by, then you're out of luck. So ways what we're trying to take was to see if you could make it easier under the California law for people to prepare food at home for sale, and that would help vegans as well as others. There are other mechanisms, but if the question is like, what about a more robust Animal Welfare Act, right? Or what about defining rodents as animals for that act, right? I think there's some possibilities. Part of it I think requires working in coalition. So do you know the work of Aisha Akhtar? Oh,
I know the name, but
yeah, so she's a scientist, a research scientist who has written at some length about the uselessness and actual counterproductivity of virtually all animal testing for developing new medicines, right? And the basic idea is that, we are different enough, even from animals that are in many ways similar to us, like rats and mice, that the fact that a drug works in rats is not very predictive of it working in humans. And more troublingly, perhaps, the fact that it doesn't work in rats and mice doesn't tell you that it won't work in humans. And so some of these potentially very promising medicines or treatments are knocked out because they don't work in animals. And so there's an opportunity, I think, to build coalitions. There's an organization, I get their newsletter, called White Coat Waste, it's basically an anti-government libertarian group, which is not normally my political orientation, against the mandate for animal testing because they think it's enormously wasteful and just costs a lot of money. And now I think some of the people there are actually also have some sympathy for the animals. So there's, maybe that's partly just how they position themselves. But in any event, I think a lot of the people who read about that are like, yeah, I don't see why we should have unnecessary animal testing as well. So I think that there's, that's a place for the law to work on a sort of regulatory basis as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, that makes total sense. And I remember when I read Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, years ago, he talks about how if all that the law did, if all that we required was to show that animal testing was necessary, then that alone would eliminate 90% of the testing that's done. And yes, that whole paradigm regarding animal testing, it seems to me, and this is something that occurred to me shortly after I went vegan, was that we had it completely flipped. The paradigm currently holds that, they're similar enough to us humans that what we learn from them scientifically will translate to us humans, but they're different enough that their suffering doesn't matter. I don't
Yeah,
suffer in the
right,
same way.
right. And I think people ought to be receptive to this idea, given their speciesism. I mean, for goodness sake, we know that there are drugs that are tested on a sample group of men that aren't effective in women, right? And we're the same species, so it shouldn't be surprising that there are differences in efficacy from species to species.
Right, right. So, how much interest do you sense among your students at Cornell,
Um,
in veganism and animal rights?
yeah, so it waxes and wanes. There are always a few vegan students. I'm very proud to say that the so I my main classes each year, I teach a first year class in constitutional law, typically to about 70 students. And then I teach an upper class in something more technical called federal courts, and I typically teach a seminar or something. But every year I select my teaching assistant for the following year as like the best student from the previous year. If they're willing to do it. Sometimes they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, too busy," or "You seem like a jackass. I don't want to be your teaching assistant." But so my teaching assistant last year is a woman named Debbie Morales, is a vegan, but I didn't pick her because she's a vegan. Picked her because she got the best grade on my anonymously graded exam. I knew she was a vegan, so I was delighted when I discovered, oh, look, the vegan got the best grade, and she's also now editor in chief of the Law Review. So I always connect with the vegan students.
And they're the smartest, of course.
Of course, right. Not always, but they're always the nicest. And, I also have some connection with some of the undergrads. Sherry was a faculty advisor to the Cornell Vegan Society. I would be that, but that sort of went defunct. But there's some other sets of organizations. So I'm pretty obviously vegan. I mean, I don't, it doesn't really come up when you're talking about, judicial review. We are given a budget to have to take students out, and I'll say if I'm making a meal for students, it'll be vegan, and so they know that. Most of them have heard of it. I had one very good student this past year. Actually, I've had him first the previous year. He was almost the best student, not quite, almost as good as that. But so he came into law school vegetarian. I think he's virtually vegan now. And he's basically for environmental reasons. So I do some of that. I could tell you about the pie eating contest if you want.
Sure.
So this would have been for the first time was in 2010. 2010? Yeah, I think so. In 2010, no, in 2011, the students came up with the idea that they should have a faculty pie eating contest. And the pie eating contest is, you get a pie, you get 3 minutes to eat it. You can't use your hands. They weigh the pie before, they weigh it after. You can't knock crumbs onto the ground. So it's how much pie you can eat in that 3 minutes. And the first year they had it, I was on leave, so I didn't participate. The next year they asked me if I wanted to do it. I said, well, will there be vegan pies? And I have to say, I said that half in the hope that they would say no, so I could say, well, then I can't do it. They said, we'll bake you a vegan pie. So I said, oh, I guess if they're going to bake me a vegan pie, I have to participate. So I entered, and I won.
What kind of pie was it?
The first year I chose pumpkin pie, which was a mistake.
Oh, you got to choose.
Yeah, well, it was a mistake because the reason I chose pumpkin pie is I like pumpkin pie, and then I couldn't eat it for several years because I was so disgusted with it. So the next year, they asked me if I wanted to defend my crown, and I said yes. And the short of it is, they held it for 4 years, as I said. I didn't participate the first year, but I won each of the other 3 years. And the first time I won, the rumor was, well, of course he won. The vegan pie must be denser or something than that. So I heard this was going on. I said, give everybody a vegan pie. So the following year, they did give everybody a vegan pie, which was great. And I won again. And then the claim was, well, of course you won. You're used to eating vegan pie.
That's funny. That's
funny. So, and the truth is, the reason I won has nothing to do with the fact that I'm vegan, except maybe that I'm used to eating more food, right? Because you have to eat more total volume to get the same number of calories as a vegan. But I think the reason I won is that I'm just ridiculously competitive. And then
and you're used to not using silverware because as a vegan, you're not really domesticated. Yeah.
Right. They discontinued it after 2014 or something, which I was delighted to see it go away. And then somehow they revived it this past year, and so I entered and I won again. But I've decided I'm not going to do it.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm gonna retire now, mostly because I'm sort of trying to eat whole food, plant based, and pies doesn't fit within that.
Well, that's very impressive. I mean, you're a very accomplished individual, but I had no
Yes,
idea
yes.
you were at
I'm
this
gonna retire
level.
undefeated. Right. Well, but the
Yeah.
reason I thought of it was that the purpose of this is to raise money for various good causes. And the way they raise money is, I said you get 3 minutes. You actually get 3 minutes plus however much time is purchased by people making donations to your particular cause.
Oh,
So
okay.
I had my money go to a well-fed world, and I was co-sponsored by the Cornell Environmental Law Society. So the head of the Environmental Law Society, who was a student of mine, interviewed me before, and it was a very funny interview. So we enjoyed that. So yes, I feel like the students are receptive to it. Doesn't mean there are all that many vegans here. I wouldn't say we have fewer than, the kind of baseline you'd expect among people their age in that socioeconomic group, but we don't have a lot more either.
Well, and also, I mean, just law students, how ethical are law students, generally speaking? I mean, you've got that working against you as well.
Right.
I'm just kidding because I was a law student, so I can I can poke fun at them.
But you
Okay, well, I've
describe
got
yourself as an escaped lawyer or a hovering lawyer.
yes,
Yeah.
running from the
Right.
law.
Yeah.
Running from the law. Yes, indeed. So I've got just a couple more questions for you. But I'm curious, you've been vegan, quite some time now. How have you evolved personally as a vegan?
The ethical commitment hasn't changed. Started, I was less of a healthy vegan, and then I went through periods where I was more and less, and now I'm sort of trying to be as healthy as possible as a vegan. The the piece that has it for me in recent years is the environmental, which I had been thinking of as a separate category, but partly in response to a talk that Mylan Engel gave at Summerfest a few years ago, I've come to think of environmentalism as a kind of animal rights cause. They're not exactly the same. So Sherry and I each have written about how conservation, which aims at preserving species, and Sherry would say that it aims at preserving species as exemplars of particular strands of DNA, right, is different from animal rights. So she wrote about that in I thought, a very provocative column involving a giraffe in a Danish zoo some years ago. There was this giraffe that seemed like was loved by zoo goers, and zoos are problematic, but put that aside for the moment. And the zoo was going to kill this giraffe because he was not contributing to the diversity of giraffe DNA, and they needed room for a different giraffe. And so, from a conservation biology perspective, which is a branch of environmentalism, that makes a certain kind of sense. But from an animal rights perspective, it doesn't. So in that sense, there can be tension between animal rights and environmentalism. But broadly speaking, they're, keeping the earth inhabitable for humans and other animals is a kind of ethical obligation. And so I've come to see environmentalism as not exactly a subset of my veganism, but strongly parallel. And I'd had a version of that for a while, right? So, like, is palm oil vegan? Well, I've tried to avoid palm oil for years, but that was because I knew that the, orangutans were being killed directly to make the palm oil. Even if they weren't killing the orangutans, my feeling now is I would avoid it because they're chopping down rainforests to create palm plantations, and that's destroying habitat for free living animals. So I think that has been a one major shift in how I think about what I'm doing as a vegan.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for me, just in my own personal evolution, it's just been so fascinating to me on sort of a cosmic level how all of these causes seem to align, no matter what direction you approach it from. Veganism seems to be the answer. The most loving thing we can do for our bodies is also the most loving thing for the planet and other animals and for other human beings across the planet. So, yeah, it's very interesting. All right. Well, really appreciate your time today and appreciate you discussing, everything ranging from nuanced legal principles to, your own your marriage and your dearly departed wife. So, thank you for getting so personal with us.
Thanks for
Mike,
asking.
and final question: is there a single word for you that for you sums up what being vegan is all about?
Um, so I haven't thought about that question. I guess if I were, so this is a tentative answer, I reserve the right to change it, but perhaps integrity, right? That and integrity in the sense of, things fitting together, right? So for me, although as I said, I didn't think of animal ethics much as a child, at the point at which I did as an adult, I kind of knew that veganism was where I had to get. And so it,
Yes, yes, that makes total sense to me. I resonate with that completely. And in fact, that's the same answer that one of my previous guests, who's a Bosnian genocide survivor, that's the
oh,
answer she gave as well. So you're in good company, of course.
glad to hear it.
All right. Well, we close every episode of the Vegan Posse by taking 30 seconds of silence for all the suffering animals, human and non human, who desire, as we all do, safety, happiness, and the freedom to live out their lives without interference. So, Mike, I invite you to join me in 30 seconds of silence for the animals, and we'll conclude with the sound of the bell. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Posse. See you next time. Until then, stay strong and stay true.